I'm here with physiotherapist and ADCC competitor Livia Giles and strength conditioning coach Ben King, discussing S&C for Jiu-Jitsu. In the last video, we explored S&C for the recreational grappler, the do's, the don'ts, as well as some practical tips. Now we're going to switch gears and focus our attention on the competitive grappler and challenges they face when introducing S&C into an already packed training regime. So what might be some of the key differences between doing S&C for a competitive grappler versus someone who is training more recreationally, Ben?
So training can change depending on a number of things, but the key one I think is worth getting across is the time of the year. So the training doesn't necessarily have to go from January to December and keep increasing every month, or every session by session by session. So given the type of year that it is, you might emphasize a quality or take away a quality. And I think one of the concepts that'll help this is thinking about vertical integration. So vertical integration is from a famous track and field coach, Charlie Francis, who basically every quality he was working on all the time, nothing kind of went in or out of his program. It was always there, but he would emphasize certain qualities and de-emphasize certain qualities. So imagine like a DJ board, as you might turn the treble and bass up, but turn the EQ down. So it's just the time of year that you might emphasize certain things and take certain things away. And that's where it sinks it back in with what are your goals for a certain phase, and are you developing or just maintaining a quality? So is this a time of the year where you're out of competition, you've got a lot of time, you can really sink your teeth into the gym? You might really try and push a quality. And Dan Johns, another S&C coach that talks about this, say park bench training or bus bench training. So park bench, you're just sitting along, you're maintaining, you're doing enough not to get worse, and you're just kind of enjoying the process of staying fit while your jiu-jitsu might be really skyrocketing and you're really rolling hard. There might be then, that equation might flip, and you might have bus bench training where you're really trying to hit it, push a quality, get stronger, get more powerful, get more mobile, really push a quality to its nth degree while you've got that time, both in a competition sense, but in terms of your week and your training that you need to do for jiu-jitsu. In terms of the athlete that you are, for a novice, it's probably worthwhile looking at the more simple stuff. And that's generally speaking for a long time is focus on the simple stuff, get really good at it. And high level competitors will have the simple stuff down pat. And you can say that both in a jiu-jitsu context, but both in a gym context, is if you're a high level competitor, you can do the simple stuff really, really well. If you're more an advanced competitor and you've got a bit of a background in doing S&C, you can look at the complex methods and how you would apply them within a more context environment.
Yeah, I totally agree. Liv, what are your thoughts on this particular question?
I think probably as a elite or competitive grappler, S&C has a lot more to do with your goals. So even from my own experience, I had to sort of dabble in S&C as a blue belt and for about 6 months. And I think the goal was mainly just to be stronger and fitter. It was quite a big scale goal. Whereas when I came back to it as a black belt, I had very specific goals of why I was doing it. That's probably the biggest differences for me.
And you also have experience being an athlete before, where you were working in track cycling and in gymnastics. And obviously gymnastics, a very physically demanding sport, track cycling, highly demanding sport. You did S&C there, and then when you came to jiu-jitsu, how did stuff change for you? Firstly,
in gymnastics, I was a rhythmic gymnast, so I was the tall. Well, I was never tall. You're meant to be tall and anorexic and punsy. So conditioning was mainly body weight conditioning. So I was never super strong, even though my body type was kind of reflecting that. When I did trek cycling, I was a sprinter. So there was a massive emphasis on strength because you power to weight ratio was extremely important, and you had to be strong to be able to push the big gears in order to get to full speed and then generate the speed and power required. So that was a really big emphasis on training. When I started jiu-jitsu, I think my then coach and Lockie as well really emphasized not to use my strength over skill. So I had tendency to try to overpower, people my size and to make my skill work. And obviously, as we all know, that only works maybe on a complete beginner who's your size. So my first coach pretty much banned me from doing S&C and banned me from doing any strength work. So I would concentrate on skill development. And that's pretty much what I did for many years until I got to that more elite level where it was that sort of cherry on top of the cake. And what about you, Tom? Did you have any big differences between your competitive and recreational grappler?
So I think as a competitive grappler, what's happening is you're probably training 6 or more times a week, and therefore you've got to be very careful with the amount of recovery that you're getting. You can't just add strength and conditioning on top, because if you suddenly add 5 or 6 strength and conditioning sessions on top, then you're probably going to get injured. You're probably going to overdo things. So it's really important to improve the quality of your planning. You need to think, where are the opportunities for me to do S&C? How is this impacting upon my jiu-jitsu training? And am I achieving the goals that I want to do? So it's all about prioritizing exactly what you need to do. And this is quite different to a recreational person. Whereas a recreational person, you can probably do a bit of everything. You can probably do a bit of strength, a bit of conditioning, a bit of all the different things that we've talked about before. And it doesn't matter which ones you work on. Whereas as a professional or as a competitive athlete, you need to really pick and choose your battles. What is it you need to do now to close the gap between where you are and where you want to get? And once you've achieved that, once you've got to a certain level of strength, for example, maybe now it's about being able to express your strength in a shorter period of time. Just a simple example, it seems to be very clear about what your priorities are, and you need to change it as you go along. Your physical prep off the mat also needs to be highly integrated with what you're doing on the mat. What that means is that you need to look at your program and you need to analyze it and you need to see where the opportunities are. And that might mean making adjustments to your jiu-jitsu training as well. So for example, maybe you're training morning and afternoon, and it's normal for everyone to roll every session. Well, maybe there's 2 or 3 sessions a week where you miss that hard rolling, and you take that time to then spend on doing your physical prep. Liv, as an athlete, did you ever use any of those strategies? Did you think about stuff that you might have to adjust in your jiu-jitsu training in order to allow you to do S&C, or were you okay and you could just do it on top of what you were doing normally?
I definitely had to change how I rolled. I did have a plan written out, and this is in preparation for ADCC. So generally, I probably, unless there was a specific need like injury rehab, I probably actually wouldn't take away mat time to lift weights. I would do it on top, or I would definitely prioritize my jiu-jitsu. However, in lead up to ADCC, I had to prioritize injury rehab and bulking up. So that was the time I really had to think about the structure of my training and how I rolled. I tend to overtrain, and I tend to have a plan and then not stick to it. So we tried different ways to monitor my load to get me off the mats. But I think it's finally, it's through my head now that if I am going to have quality training sessions and not be exhausted for the following 4 days, I pretty much rolled hard in the mornings. I did weights 3 times a week, and most of my night rolls were light, if not at all. So I would just do things like specific training from 50-50 where it wasn't any energy consuming. I would drill more, but I would sit out of rolls or roll lightly and practice my transitions and pick the lighter girls and so on. But during the day, during pro sessions, I would always go pretty hard. And that's probably 8 weeks before the competition, not all year round either.
Yeah. I think that probably brings up an important question as well, which is that, or an important observation, which I think is that you need to make sure that when you start adding S&C to your program, especially if you're a competitive grappler, you talk to your coach about this as well. Because when you go to, if your jiu-jitsu is completely separate from your S&C, then your jiu-jitsu coach probably has expectations for what you're going to do. In other words, you're going to train hard most of the days that you come. Whereas if you're coordinating that with your jiu-jitsu coach, you're going to say, oh, it's Wednesday afternoon. Remember, I'm not going to be training as hard today because I'm going to do my S&C afterwards. And if that isn't already built into your program, and I imagine it won't be most of the time, then having those discussions will be super important. And obviously, Liv and Lockie, they knew about that because they were planning it together. But that might not necessarily be the case in many scenarios that you see on the mats.
Yeah, and I think for in jiu-jitsu, every academy is completely different. We tend to, our students have the autonomy to really train how they like to train, but a lot of the times the professors or instructors really don't like when you sit out of rolls and you have to roll every round, whereas that's not the case at our academy. You sort of judge it on your own merit, on your own body. So you do really have to pay attention to what's kind of the social requirement at your particular academy.
What's a worthwhile thought there, I think, is if you have to prioritize in making those decisions, is if you can have a plan in place ahead of time, and like you said, on a Wednesday night, you might roll easier, or there's times where you might roll easier, but having contingencies in place in terms of your week, if you have to drop a session, what will it be? And as we've said before, you might skip an S&C session in preference of a hard roll, depending on the time of year. So if we go back a step, in time of year, you've got ages until competition, you might skip an easier drilling session or an easier session to do more S&C based. Or if you're closer to competition, you're absolutely not skipping a hard roll, because that's going to get you in shape for what's coming up. So having contingencies in place and having a plan ahead of what's coming, and then knowing what's going to drop first, is really helpful with any athlete or coach.
I think to add to that, it also, for some people, depend on training partners. So just the same as, whether you have a competition coming up, especially for me, I'm a smaller female. So obviously we don't get as many training partners as your average 70-kilo male would, that are appropriate to go hard with. So I would have to definitely change my plan depending on who turned up to the training session.
That is what makes combat so difficult to program for and to combat, is because so much of training is required by the training partner or the environment, where other sports, where their own body is the training vessel or something, they just have to run faster or jump higher. I'm not saying that that's easy to do, but it's much more dependent on themselves than training partners. And that's something that we battled with hugely, is that I would have plans in place for a heavy week or a light week, and that would be completely thrown out by the fact that there was good training partners that week, or there wasn't. So you have to be adaptable and agile in your approach. You can't be too dogmatic. And this is to any S&C coaches that are listening, is if you have a plan in place that this is the deload week, and all of a sudden you get 3 or 4 good training partners, there goes your plan. So you've got to be on your feet and thinking, okay, how do I counteract this and plan for this when this happens? And that's what makes combat programming so unique compared to other sports, is that relatively speaking, you can plan further ahead, but in grappling and jiu-jitsu, you may not have that affordance.
I think as a coach, that's a really important skill to master, though, because you've got this kind of paradox between most really good coaches are excellent at planning, but as well as being excellent at planning, you have to be very adaptable and able to change your plan depending on what's happening. I remember every year I planned at least in track and field, I was working university at the time, we started in university in September, and we'd go through and have our first competition season in January, and I used to plan these training program out, and then I used to look at what we actually did. And every year, we always used to do less than what I planned, because for obvious reasons, not everyone adapts at the same rate. And especially in track and field, you've got to be extremely careful not to get injuries, because injuries really, in jiu-jitsu, if you break your thumb, you can still train. In track and field, if you have any kind of injury whatsoever, that basically stops you from being able to do the most effective training, like running or whatever else you need to do. So you have to be very, very careful with your injuries. And I never ever, basically over the first 6 years of my professional coaching career, never actually did what I wrote down on a piece of paper. So it's important to make your plan, but it's also really important to make sure that you're adaptable to it. Okay, and I think this brings us nicely to our next question, which is, from my perspective, I imagine there are 2 types of competitive grappler when it comes to strength conditioning. There's the people that have already been doing strength and conditioning before. Maybe they did it in a different sport, or maybe they're already doing it. And you've got those people who are competitive grapplers who are completely new to it. Maybe they're the younger competitors, they're coming through, maybe they're 18, 19, they start to want to add some S&C into the program. Ben, starting with you, what advice can you give to each group, the person that's been doing S&C for a while, and also the person that's completely new to it?
I think a relevant concept for both groups to start off with is the minimal effective dose. And this is a term that gets thrown around a fair bit in strength and conditioning and sports science, but the concept being, and I think this applies in many aspects of life, business, if you can do the little amount as possible that gets you a benefit, then that's worthwhile doing. And it's a checks and balances process of iteration of, you may make some mistakes early on, but trying to figure out what is the least amount you can do to get some effective benefit from that. Anything more than that, and you may start to see other things decline. And that's the art of coaching, both in a strength and conditioning sense, but in a jiu-jitsu sense, is that you're constantly balancing multiple balls at a certain time. It's a juggling act. And if one ball becomes a little bit heavier, all of a sudden the rhythm starts to flow out, and that's where you run into poor performance or injuries. So I would be asking the question, what is the least that you can do and still get better? That would be my main question, is it worth going on this wild program that, yes, it can emphasize your fitness and strength, but if that's a hard time of the year for jiu-jitsu, then all of a sudden you've got two things that are ramping up at the same time, and you're on a crash course. Like the wheels are going to fall off at some stage. It just depends on how badly that's going to happen. So now that question is going to look a little bit different from someone who has S&C experience to someone that doesn't. Someone who has S&C experience before might need to do a little bit more, or be a little bit more targeted in how they're going about their training. Someone who's done a little bit less, they might be able to do a little bit less, and they might be able to get away with something a little bit more simple and a little bit more, generic in terms of a template. But if you're doing 4 or 5 different templates, like I know a lot of S&C exists. You can buy general templates now, and you can buy jiu-jitsu anthologies and templates, and they're all, don't get me wrong, they're fantastic resources. But if you're putting together 4 or 5 templates that weren't necessarily designed to work together, all of a sudden you've created this pretty dangerous cauldron, and that's going to bubble over at some place. So you'd want to have a pretty experienced coach managing that together and making sure the ingredients kind of fit together. Liv, what would you say is your advice on this topic?
So for the competitive grappler who is new to S&C, I would say definitely don't do much too quickly. Also, don't think of S&C as another sport you're trying to do. I think it's really important to remember that you're, I hope, doing S&C to help you with, say, jiu-jitsu or grappling or wrestling, whatever it might be. And it's important to stick to that. Some people I see in physio from being injured might be from things like doing CrossFit or too much, weightlifting. They're trying to do too much too quickly, and their original aim was to get stronger or fitter, but they're actually getting more injured by doing that program. So just remember, you're not doing another sport. You're doing something to help you with the sport that you're already doing. For the more advanced person in S&C, I guess that applies to someone newer as well, is just don't get too competitive with yourself. So I know, being a competitor, I am competitive, and I really love seeing PBs at the gym. It brings me so much satisfaction to do my heaviest deadlift and so on, but I continually have to bring myself back and kind of weigh up the safety and risk and reward. So is it worth me doing a deadlift that's 5 kilo heavier when my back is a little bit sore? I know I have to train that afternoon, and I'm not feeling quite right. What's that extra 5 kilos on the bar going to achieve versus, my goal in jiu-jitsu, which is to, do a better heel hook or berimbolo. So I have to continually ask myself that, and even get Lockie to kind of go, don't do it, there's no point, or Ben kind of going, nah, just leave it.
Put in capitals on the program, no missed reps.
Yeah, and I still missed them, didn't I? I was like, I can lift that, no problem. 20 kilos above my PB. Anyway, yeah. I'm learning as I go. I think you have to make the mistakes yourself as well.
But self-awareness is it's the be all and end all of any progression as a person, right? And it's not so easily gained. And I think having that and being aware of your flaws, most people are more susceptible to their own flaws than they realize. And I think this is true in a training context, is that they see a bar, they see weights, speaking on experience, a lot of grappling or MMA gyms might not have a full gym set out. So there's minimal amounts of weight there. And the goal all of a sudden becomes, what should I do? Or just because you can do it doesn't mean that you should do it. Just because there is 160 kilos worth doesn't mean you should deadlift all of it. You should deadlift what's relevant to you at that particular time. Tom, what are your takeaways on this topic?
I think a lot of you guys have covered a lot of the points that I would make. As a new person, new to strength and conditioning, realize that you're going to get benefit from almost anything you do. So, have a generic program, get good at the key skills that you're going to need to be able to be good and effective at S&C, which means learn the right technique, slowly, progressively overload that technique, and take it slow to start with. That's the key thing for the people that are new, because if you haven't done strength conditioning before and you go in the gym and let's say you do 3 sets of 10 different exercises, when you walk out, you'll probably feel quite good, and then 3-4 days later, you'll suddenly be like you hit a brick wall. So your body's not going to be used to that. So you need to slowly get used to it as you progress, and realize that initially you're going to make exponential gains because you're new to that. So don't be in a race with yourself to get better really quickly. You probably got a long time left ahead of you to train, and just prepare for that. You're preparing for the journey to get good at S&C. if you're already doing strength and conditioning, you've got a background, you've got good technique, you're used to that stuff, then the key thing is exactly what you said. It's like the 80-20 rule. You probably get 80% of the benefit from 20% of the stuff you're doing. So find out what it is that works the best for you and use that stuff to get good, and save the rest of the time for being good at jiu-jitsu. And I can't emphasize, talked about this so many times, but I can't emphasize this more than anything else. Like, if you see somebody and they're hitting PBs and stuff in the gym as a jiu-jitsu athlete and they're looking fantastic, trust me, that's because they're spending a lot of time doing strength and conditioning and not enough time doing jiu-jitsu. It's why top level athletes in any sport, they don't spend more time than they need to in the gym. In fact, for me, it's a big red flag. If I see somebody that's fantastic in the gym, I'm like, PBs in the gym don't mean anything. And I think, Ben, you worked with some weightlifters before, so you can maybe emphasize this, but like, one of the things we were talking about off air was the fact that, let's say the front squat in a clean, in a clean and jerk, a front squat is a key component of a clean and jerk. Yet most weightlifters are probably going to tell you that if I increase my front squat by 20 kilograms, it probably has almost no bearing on the fact how much I'm going to be able to clean and jerk, despite the fact it's actually a component of the clean and jerk activity. So PBs in gym don't necessarily lead to improvements in performance in your sport, and you have to keep that in mind, because it's so easy to forget about that and end up basically becoming an S&C athlete. In other words, a CrossFitter rather than a jiu-jitsu athlete who's using S&C to improve their sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, certainly one of the things in strength conditioning education was one of the problems that you get taught, that strength is the cure-all. If you get strong, it'll increase all of your other physical abilities. And that's not even considering what are the relevant sports skills that are involved. And don't get me wrong, like, strength is important. You need to get strong to be better at certain physical abilities. But whether that relates to sport or not is the eternal question. And I think as an S&C coach, all you are taught is get strong, 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 strong. And then, it doesn't take very long to work at a high level that you start to realize that the strongest athletes aren't always the best sporting athletes. There's a reason why powerlifting is its own sport, is because that's a pursuit that you have to pursue over a very long time. And it's not easy. It's not an easy skill or ability to gain. Powerlifters they can PB after, 10, 15, 20 years of competition. While there's certainly benefit to gain from doing strength and conditioning, I would just loathe to think anyone listen to this and go away and say, yeah, that's what I've been missing is strength conditioning. All of a sudden I'm going to be an ADCC competitor because now I've got this great S&C program. It can certainly help, and I think it can take you to the next level, but it's not the reason you got there. It's the skill of the sport, and you being better at sport got you there.
No, I wonder how much, what you see on Instagram and social media as well. Like, sometimes you see certain guys that do strength and conditioning and might win worlds or ADCC, and they actually post their workouts, but they don't necessarily post every training session because they might not want people to see what they're working on. And so a lot of the guys just see their S&C all the time. So like, sometimes we'll have someone amazing come to do a seminar, and some of the questions are like, what's your strength and conditioning? How much CrossFit do you do? And they're kind of like, why don't you ask technique questions? But I think a lot of the times it's like what's seen on social media as well. So don't be deluded by that.
Tom, for you, what is important for a grappler to focus on in their S&C? How do they go about figuring out what are the things in their program that are going to help, and what are the things they should leave to the wayside?
Sure. Well, for me, I try to keep it simple, just as an idea to get you guys starting to think about this stuff. Obviously, the key thing is if you get yourself a coach, they'll help you with this. But the way that I do it is that I try and do a needs analysis based on 3 basic levels. So the first level is what do I, as an athlete, as a generic athlete, need to get better at? Okay. The second level I talk about is what do I, as a grappler, need to get better at? And finally, at the top level, what do I, as a grappler competing in ADCC at the under 60 kilogram weight category, need to get better at? And I think if you look at those 3 areas, that will start to give you a list of things that you need to improve upon. Okay. The second thing I think you need to be a little bit careful about is don't confuse what you need to be better at for competition to what you need to be better at in order to be able to withstand your training. And this is something that I want to bring up very quickly, because I think there's a concept in combat sports, train hard, fight easy, which I think does have some benefits. If you do the right training, you should be prepared for the fight, and the fight should go relatively smoothly for you. But if your training is so damn difficult that you have to basically prepare to do your own training, then that can be an issue, right? So you need to always be thinking about preparing for your competition, not preparing to do training. So if your training is so difficult that basically you don't have any energy left to do anything else, then you're basically spending all your time preparing to train hard. That's an issue. So quickly looking at those three areas, let's imagine, what do I need to do to be better as an athlete to start with? Well, here are some real simple things. You need to look at yourself as an athlete. It could be an athlete across any sport. And you need to look at your general posture, and you need to say, okay, what elements of my posture are bad, for example, that I would generally need to correct? Because if you correct your posture, in general, it will lead to you being a better athlete, which will then help you be a better grappler and then a better ADCC competitor. The second thing to look at is things like range of motion in the joints, and maybe range of motion in spinal segments. We already talked about this earlier when Liv said that her back hinges in the lumbar spine, whereas Lockie's hinges in the thoracic spine, and therefore what you want to do is have it so, or at least try and make the body more symmetrical to some extent. So you've got that, developing yourself as an athlete first. Then you're going to go on, you're going to look at yourself as a grappler. And here you're taking the same basic principles and now you're applying them to jiu-jitsu. So you're saying, okay, what ranges of motion are required in order for me to play my game? So, if you're playing an outside-based game, you're probably going to need greater range of motion. Let's say playing De La Riva or Berimbolo, this type of stuff, you're going to need to be flexible in order to get good guard recovery, etc. Whereas let's say you're playing more inside-based game, then maybe you don't have to be as flexible as that. So as a grappler, based on the game that I'm playing, what do I need to have in terms of my range of motion? But also, what areas need to be overloaded in order to be effective at the game I'm trying to play? So let's say you're used to doing Toreandos and stuff like this. Maybe you need to be fast because that's your area of expertise. So maybe you want to develop your qualities there to be a fast passer. Whereas if you're someone that's more slow and methodic, maybe it'd be better to develop isometric strength and things like this. So you need to look at yourself in terms of those things. And then finally, you need to look at what are you going to do in terms of your weight category and the rule set that you're undertaking. So for example, strength levels. For some rule sets, strength will be far more important than it would be for others. So if you're playing a rule set where you don't have to wrestle, for example, I don't think strength is necessarily as important because you're basically going to be often pulling guard, playing off your back, or going straight into passing. Whereas if you have to do a lot of wrestling, then strength is highly related to wrestling. So probably you're going to need to be a little bit stronger. Okay. The second thing would be something as simple as framing. Okay. If I'm going to play absolute, maybe I need to have a slightly stronger upper body to hold the athlete off for a little bit longer while I get my legs back in position, for example. Whereas if you're just playing at your weight category or whatever, you're already strong enough in the upper body, then you won't necessarily need to develop that. And that goes also for something like conditioning. So conditioning, what is the pace at which your fights occur at? If you're in a lighter category, you're going to need to maintain a higher pace than if you're in a lower category. And also, again, with the type of work you're doing, again, if you're competing ADCC rules and you've suddenly got that overtime and you've got to wrestle at the end of the training, you're going to need to be, fitness is probably going to be more important in that scenario than it would be in a different rule set. And finally, look at the high risk areas. Okay, so related to your rule set, what are the high risk areas in my body that I need to protect? So again, just taking wrestling as an example. The bit I'm always scared about, and the reason that I personally don't do any real wrestling in my jiu-jitsu training, is because when you wrestle, your knees are going to be somewhat, at risk, and so you're probably going to need to make sure that you do some strength training and some proprioceptive work to protect your knees, because knee injuries are highly related to wrestling. But let's say you were doing something like EBI overtime, then probably you'd need to do something to start to, as much as possible, protect your elbows, as an example. So you need to look at those areas. So again, start with the athlete, then look at and think about the generic stuff, posture, balance, coordination, all these kind of things. Then look at yourself as a grappler, and then get far more intricate and look at yourself in terms of your rule sets and what is important for them. So that's what I do in terms of a needs analysis for an athlete.
Yeah, I would jump in there, Tom, and say I totally agree. And if you're going to do one of your areas of your program really well, it would be this area. Is if you do this area wrong, is what we're trying to do in any program is direct and orient ourselves towards what is successful, right? Like we're making decisions and predictions, and we're applying interventions to make our current state reflect what is a successful state at the top level. So if you're basing your decisions, and every coach has this, right? Every coach has certain biases, or they've got certain ways that they go about it based on either their own experience or what their mentor taught them. So if you can do a really good job of this and make sure you're training, and this is where you hire external coaches and when you get other people involved, is if you can have your training oriented towards both yourself as a person, but the sport, and then specifically to the rule set, is you're orienting to yourself now towards reality and what is actually happening and what is successful. And you can look at any number of sports that do this to a high level, look at what's happening now, assess where you currently are, and then look at the difference between those two things and start addressing the discrepancies in small and logical steps. So you can say, okay, so I see now, and this is exactly what Lockie did in his preparation, right? ADCC has lots of wrestling and lots of leg locks. So he addressed those two areas in the smallest and logical steps, and that just built and built and built and built and built until he went and competed. So I would argue if you're going to do an area of your program well, it's this. And then the program will come of this, is whatever intervention you decide to do on the back of this will be relative to the quality of your analysis. And this is where you need to put your most time and attention into to make sure you're getting the most efficient transfer from your training.
Absolutely. And one thing that I didn't mention really was when I talked about athlete, grappler, weight category, rule set grappler, you should start with the athlete first, right? So if you're a beginner or you're not or a novice to S&C, then probably the first thing you need to fix is the things that make you a good athlete. Once you're a good athlete, then you can become a good grappler. Once you become a good grappler, then you can become excellent for your weight category or your rule set. And that's generally a logical way. And it doesn't mean you wouldn't do a bit of each of those three things at once, just like you talked about vertical integration earlier, where all things are happening all the time, but you're just emphasizing a different thing. But certainly, if there's one thing you're going to fix first, it's the stuff that was required as an athlete. Then you're going to go on to grappler, then you're going to go on to weight category grappler. Liv, what do you think about that framework, and how do you see that fitting in from a physiotherapy perspective?
I think it fits in perfectly with physio, but also with just jiu-jitsu. So we're pretty much like Lockie and I, and we try to encourage most of our competitors to do a plan as well. So, go a year out, and what is your goal? Well, if your goal is to win black belt gi worlds, it might be very different to ADCC prep, and you might need very different attributes. And then we go back from that, and it comes down to, planning your monthly training session into like, what positions do you believe that will help you achieve a goal of whatever it is. So if you believe that to win black belt worlds in the gi, you need to be really good at De La Riva and outside guards and berimbolos, you need to then go back and address like, what attributes do I need? Do I need better range of motion in my hips? And you can fix that with strength and conditioning. I think another thing to mention is, you want to say with wrestling is a good example. You need to be strong to wrestle, and you need a strong neck, and you need to protect your knees, and you need a strong like back extensors as well. And you can work all this stuff in the gym, but you actually have to turn up to wrestling training. So we do have, instances where, because it is hard and it is injury prone, but you actually have to work it a year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years out to be successful. So if you're going to bother doing S&C, you actually have to work on this stuff on the mat as well.
And that actually brings me to my very nicely to my second thing, because we talked about needs analysis, and I just did a needs analysis in terms of you as the athlete. Okay. Mm-hmm. As an S&C coach coming into a program, of course I would do that. But the second thing I would do as an S&C coach is I would go to especially if I was in a situation where this afforded me to do this, like an institute situation, like the one Ben's working in, I would go to the training sessions, I would talk to the coach, and I'd work out, okay, I'd do a jiu-jitsu training analysis, where I'd go there and I'd look at what they were doing in training, and I'd try and work out, okay, what physical qualities are being developed on the mat already. So we gave a good example earlier in the podcast where we said, like, look, if you're doing 16 training sessions a week in the gi, your grip strength is probably going to be pretty damn good. So I might not need to do grip strength as a key priority away from the mat as well. So I would be looking at some simple things on what qualities developed on the mat. I'll give you some quick examples: grip strength, lower body strength, upper body strength. With each of those things, there's also going to be a component of who your training partners are. So for example, if you're a lighter athlete training with heavier training partners, then maybe a lot of strength needs will be met, especially let's say for upper body framing and all this kind of thing, pulling in the gi, especially from training those heavier partners. Then I'd go and look at cardio and the lactic side, lactic tolerance and this kind of stuff side. And I would again look at, okay, what am I developing on the mat? So for example, if your jiu-jitsu school is somewhere where you roll for an hour and a half a day, pretty hard every day, then maybe you're not going to need to do any cardio training outside the gym because it's already taken care of on the mat. And again, look at the training partners involved and like what pace they play at, what pace that individual plays at. So I'd look at that. Then I'd look at some other things like local muscular endurance. There might be some local muscular endurance requirements for the sport. Grip strength probably being the main one in jiu-jitsu, but there could be other areas that are important. And the final area I'd look at is what proprioception is being developed in those training sessions. So as an example, if you're doing lots of wrestling training in your jiu-jitsu, then you're probably developing like sport-specific proprioception. Whereas if you were only pulling guard and stuff, I'd probably then, as an S&C coach, go, okay, there's not much proprioception work being done on the mat. Maybe it's something I'd do off the mat in an S&C scenario, or as I'd give them as a warm-up before they do their jiu-jitsu. So I'd also want to do an analysis of the actual training on the mat. And this gives me then opportunities where I can make a difference off the mat with my S&C. So that's the second phase. Ben, do you do something like this in your daily work? How does this fit in?
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I start with an athlete, and it's a two-step process, I guess, is the first is to go see their training environment and what are the things that are emphasized in that environment and what do they get out of their training? And then the question I ask myself is when I leave is then go, what does the sport need but doesn't develop? And that's where I can fit and fill the gaps. And secondly, then is trying the sport myself and seeing what it actually feels like. So there's skin in the game there where I appreciate that you can use your analytical knowledge and view the sport for what it is, but it's very different from feeling it. So one of the first sessions that I did at Absolute is I wrestled with a guy called Marcelo, and he was probably a good 30 kilos heavier than me, and he absolutely sat on me the whole session. But it gave me an appreciation for what grappling feels like and what it feels like to wrestle someone heavier than you and how to escape certain positions. And all of a sudden, while I could look at that and see that, it's different from knowing it and feeling it. And I've got any number of stories of being embarrassed by high-level competitors and me trying to do their sport. But that's not the point, is that needs analysis. And like I said before, if you can do any part of your program well, the needs analysis then directs all of your interventions towards that. So look at the sport. What does it give you? And then where can you fill the gaps? And then how do you then, and this is where I think the benefit of having a high-level S&C coach is, where can you fill the gaps in their program? You're going to know when the hard days are and when the easier days are. And this is the difference, I think, from just getting a program, going to the gym and just slamming it, is that's where it's going to be different from actually integrating the whole system together and getting everything pointing in the same direction, where it's two different ways of looking at anything, right? It's analysis versus synthesis. So analysis is just looking at the parts themselves and saying, okay, here's strength conditioning, here's my jiu-jitsu training, here's my cardio. They're all working, so everything must get better, right? But that de-emphasizes the relationships between them. So maybe you're already getting a lot of conditioning out of your rolling, so you don't need to do that as much. And that relationship back to performance, which at the end of the day is your goal, is not as high. So going through prioritizing and seeing what you need to develop more so than other is very important. So one of the things in jiu-jitsu that could be developed more so, given that the sport itself doesn't give you a lot of space to operate. The whole sport is leveraging space, either you towards an opponent or you're defending them from getting into your space, whether it be on your back or around a joint or whatever it's going to be. So there's going to be a high demand there of the sport in maximal strength. So depending on where the level of the athlete is you might then emphasize that as something to work on. Or if they're already getting enough of that in the sport that you feel, you might work on more dynamic things. So, jumps and more ballistic elements of training. That might be something you might dictate yourself more towards. Secondly, you might look at the conditioning element of jiu-jitsu and think, okay, again, this is largely dependent on the time of the year, but if they're doing really hard and high intense mat simulation rolls, etc., that's going to be really demanding on the lactate system. That's going to be hugely lactate, lots of fatigue, lots of muscle burn. So you might offset that with above and below. So you might do a little bit of generic aerobic work and low impact, given where they're at in the year. And you might make sure that their alactic system, so the really explosive stuff, is still increasing. So there's a fine balance here. You're riding a bit of a tightrope of going, okay, what is the sport giving you and what do I need to offset? And when in the year can I emphasize things and take things away? What would you think in terms of offsetting some of that stuff, Liv? in a physio sense, like in terms of things like mobility or proprioception or their injury history? What are some of the things or training considerations that you'd have for that stuff?
We kind of touched on it in the previous chapters, but definitely, even though you need a lot of mobility for the guards or guard retention you want to do, especially in the hip, but your hip structure or injury to the labrum or the socket doesn't actually allow you to do it, you're not going to go and develop that mobility because it's impossible. It will make you very, very injured and create possibly permanent damage. And I think that's when you look at different things like changing your game, so you play a different, you might look at the second most successful guard at whatever competition you're trying to do. So, we know, to give you an example, generally your outside guards, De La Riva, especially in the gi, I think you have to, in the lower weight classes, you have to be proficient at those. Like the stats show that most successful black belts have won world titles using them. But if you physically can't do it, you're not going to push your joint into the space that it can't go. So you might need to change your game and develop attributes that are relevant to that game. So it might be a different guard, might be half guard or so.
So if we go back to our needs analysis, we have a needs analysis in terms of athlete grappler and then weight category grappler. The second thing we do is we look at the physical qualities you're developing on the mat. And the third thing, which I think Ben's already touched on a little bit, is we need to look at the opportunities that we have within the week or within the month to add S&C into our training program. So as a physical preparation coach, I will go and look at the structure of the athlete's week, and I will say which days are priority for their sport. So as an example, when Lockie was preparing for ADCC and Liv were preparing ADCC, they had these competition rounds that they were doing, right? So on the days where those rounds were happening, it was really important that they were ready for those rounds. So you don't want to be doing a hard S&C session immediately before that because they'll be exhausted for those rounds. So you're looking at where the opportunities are to put S&C in. Also, you're looking at the training plan that the person's doing, and if there's no opportunities because their training plan's so full on, you have to have a discussion with them to say, okay, is there a time or a certain days or certain training sessions where we could pare that back a little bit, or we could adjust what you're doing in order to give us space in the program to then do S&C. And finally, what I'm looking at is the recovery days, because ultimately when you're a professional athlete or you're a competitive athlete, managing your recovery is what will lead over time to you becoming better and better and better. Because what you don't want to do is train 3 months really, really hard, then be injured for 6 months, not do any training, then train 3 months really hard, be injured for 6 months, not do any training. That's much worse than training 80% for an entire year. You'll get much more out of the 80% for an entire year. So that 3-step process, the needs analysis of you as an athlete, a grappler, and then a weight category grappler. Secondly, looking at the qualities that you're developing on the mat, and thirdly, looking at the opportunities that you can train. They're the 3 things that I want to look at. So, Liv, when it comes to opportunities for training during the week, how is it that, how do you look at what were your opportunities for training? How did you see where S&C could be fitted in, and how do you decide where to put it in your program?
I think it was mainly deciding whether I could do it 2 or 3 times a week. 4 was definitely too much for me. And from there, definitely trying to fit it in between the sort of the comp rounds we did for ADCC. So not on the days off, or at least after. So if I did that in the morning, I would do S&C straight at lunchtime, not beforehand. But to be honest, we just kind of had to do what was accessible and available, because I was pretty much working full time. So what I did do in prep for ADCC, I'm lucky enough, I worked for myself as a physio. So I just blocked out the times where I had to do it. I decided to do strength and conditioning, and it was my non-negotiable time. So I wouldn't book any meetings or patients or anything in that time frame. So I sort of decided that earlier on, and I think from memory it was Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Friday was my sort of a rest day from jiu-jitsu. I would just do some drilling, but I wouldn't do any rolling, and then have Sunday off. Yeah, but I was very much governed by work and coaching commitments and everything else. So sometimes, in ideal world, I would go home and rest and have a sleep and do it a little bit differently. But we managed.
So Ben, on the other side of that coin, when you saw what Liv was doing for training, how did you find the ideal places to try and put the S&C off the mat S&C into her training program? What was the process you went through there?
So given the level of athlete that Liv is, and the commitment she has in both a professional and personal sense, we had to be as pragmatic as possible. So I think there's what's ideal in a given week, and we have any number of priors to look at and any programs and old coaches and and plenty of great examples to look at, but we also need to think of what's real and happening right now in front of us. And for Liv, with the physio business, with jiu-jitsu coaching, with her own personal prep, we had to be very pragmatic and agile about how the way we went about it. We couldn't be too stuck in, and for me, certainly it was a big lesson as an S&C coach that I can't think, okay, in 4 weeks we're going to do this, or in 5 weeks we're going to do this, or there has to be a high-low model, or it has to be, because all of those rules have to go out the window. Is that to get some sort of benefit, we need to train and we need to do it intelligently. So my process was largely athlete driven, as I had to chat to Liv a lot and understand her world and get on her level, and then try to make an impact somewhere in that. And that often meant looking at the training week, and the hard days from memory were Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And my personal preference is to do a high-low model. So to grab hard things and put them on the same days, and grab easy things and put them on the same days. So you're giving yourself enough high-level stimulus to go hard. But then there's also that balance that you just mentioned. If you do a really hard S&C session just before you roll, is you're putting yourself at risk. So there was, careful management back and forth, both before and after sessions. And to be honest, a lot of working with Liv was experimentation. Is sometimes we tried before the session, sometimes we tried after, sometimes we tried off days. We had so many different phases of training that we went through, given injury history, given current status, given competition. So we just had to try and iterate, and over time we got better and better and better, and we saw better results both in the gym and on the mat. But it was only through the process of review, to the process of, is this getting better or not, and not necessarily sticking to the plan, but looking at the plan and being like, yeah, that's shit, move that on and just start a new one, and then go with the next plan, and then do the same thing as in 3 weeks. That plan you just wrote is shit, move it on, go to the next plan. Like, you just have to keep rolling with the punches and get to where you're having an impact, and not necessarily just be stuck in the plan that you had in place going forward.
Yeah. And I think, like, speaking of like time of the day, I could have gotten up earlier to do my S&C. It might have been better for me, but I'm not a morning person and I don't function well. If I wake up too early to fit in whatever program, my like rest of the week will be put out. So I think other people work really well in the mornings. I don't. So that was a big factor for me. And bottom line for me was like, I just had to do it. And it kind of like, whether it was morning, night, Tuesday or Wednesday, or I just did my 3 sessions and I stuck to that. So even though it was very, I guess, planned and constructed, sometimes I was just like, well, whatever, I'm tired, I'm just going to do it. It doesn't matter.
So before we get into the program Liv used to prepare for ADCC 2019 European Trials, let's summarise the key take-home messages from this episode. A key difference between a recreational competitive grappler is that competitors will need to adjust their program depending on the time of the year and their proximity to competition. For example, the competitor needs to ask themselves, how does my training need to change now that I'm 4 weeks away from competition compared to when I was 16 weeks out? Am I developing or simply maintaining this quality? And given where I am now, should I be spending more time on the mat or in the gym? Another important message was that you just can't add S&C on top of an already packed schedule, because if you do so, you're probably going to lead to either overtraining or injury. Instead, you need to consider the minimum effective dose. What is the smallest amount of work that I can do in order to get the job done? And consider the 80-20 rule, that 80% of the benefits will probably come from 20% of the work. While it's essential to have a plan, it's also important to be flexible and adapt to changing circumstances, as Liv found out when she realised that she had to change her plan depending on the training partners that she had from week to week. If you're experienced at S&C, you're probably excited about trying to design the perfect training program that addresses all your needs. However, you have to be careful about combining training programs without considering the consequences. Remember, you can't do everything all at once, and therefore you need to prioritise. In time, you will cover all the bases, but there's not one training program that's going to hit everything all in like a 4-week period. If you're used to training hard, consider the risk versus reward of pushing S&C to its limits. Remember, you also need to train hard on the mat. Remember, you should not be getting injured as a result of S&C. And S&C should not make you so tired that you can also not get the most out of the important jiu-jitsu sessions that you have to do during the week. If you're new to S&C, focus on the basics and aim for slow, consistent progression. Within 2 years, you will see considerable changes, almost regardless of the training program that you adopt. And remember, strength conditioning is not another sport to compete at. You're a jiu-jitsu practitioner, not a CrossFit athlete, powerlifter, or weightlifter. As a competitive grappler, either you or your coach will need to undertake a needs analysis. And here you can look at yourself from 3 perspectives. As an athlete, you need to look at your posture, your range of motion, your spinal mobility, and see what needs to be improved. As a grappler, think about the qualities that you need to undertake the game that you are playing. And as a weight category or rules grappler, consider the qualities needed to be successful at the rules set. And also think about the high-risk body parts involved. If you're undertaking something like wrestling, for example, it's going to be important to protect your knees, whereas if you may be doing EBI overtime rules, think about what you can do to strengthen your neck and also, for example, your elbows. Having completed your needs analysis, you can then start implementing your plan with a focus on the athlete level first before progressing. Once you've done your needs analysis, you need to look at your normal jiu-jitsu training plan and decide what qualities to develop on the mat in terms of both strength and conditioning. What does the sport need that doesn't already develop, and focus on these key things. Finally, look at whether there's space in your training week to do strength and conditioning, and consider the impact upon your most important training sessions on the mat. So hopefully you enjoyed the discussion, and we'll tune in next time when we look closely at the program Liv used to prepare for the 2019 ADCC European Trials. As always, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you get notifications whenever Liv and Lockie release new content. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.